1974, we got to take off the gold standard. Inflation was not the same as it is today. It's much, much higher today. You got to pull out less for that money to last if you're going to do that kind of method, right? But there is a better option. And that's what got me so excited by the time that I quit being a financial advisor. It was when I started to see the light that it wasn't about accumulation, it was about acceleration and passive income.
Welcome to the Wealth Strategy Secrets of the Ultra Wealthy podcast, where we help entrepreneurs like you exponentially build wealth through passive income to live a life of freedom and prosperity. Are you tired of paying too much in taxes, gambling your future on the stock market, and want to learn about hidden strategies for making your money work for you? And now your host, Dave Wolcott, serial entrepreneur and author of the best-selling book, The Holistic Wealth Strategy.
How's it going, everyone? And welcome back to Wealth Strategy Secrets of the Ultra Wealthy. Today's guest has one of the most eye-opening financial journeys you'll ever hear. Chris Miles started as a traditional financial advisor, teaching the same Wall Street gospel we've all been fed, until he realized that the very strategies he was selling couldn't even help his own father retire. That awakening led him to leave the industry entirely, rebuild his approach from the ground up, and ultimately retire twice by focusing on cash flow over accumulation. In this episode, Chris pulls back the curtain on the myths that keep most investors trapped, from the 401k free money illusion to the 4% withdrawal rule, and reveal the strategies he uses today to help clients free up capital, create passive income, and become work optional in record time. If you've ever suspected that conventional financial planning is designed to keep you playing someone else's game, this conversation will give you the tools to take control of your wealth and your life. And on to today's show. Chris, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here, Dave.
Yeah, great to have you on the show. And I know we are definitely aligned in terms of our thinking and our strategies. And what's really unique, you have such a unique perspective to come at this, really having that traditional financial planning background. And you saw the light and you kind of transitioned over, as I did. And really, once you kind of start to unpack, right, some of these, what we feel are like, myths or sacred cows, right, that are out there. But once you start to really look at the numbers, quantify some of the data, and make some smarter decisions for yourself, you start to realize that some of what Wall Street is talking about are truly myths. Right. So excited to kind of unpack some of those things and help investors really uncover, what are some of these myths that Wall Street has, and what are some smarter ways to be able to actually, build your wealth, hit financial freedom, and all those goals that people really want to do. So why don't we begin with a little bit about your origin story and how this journey started for you?
Yeah, I never intended to go into finance initially. Besides the fact that as a kid, I wanted to be a physicist or an astronomer, or I wanted to be a Motown music producer at one point. I had a lot of those aspirations, but, eventually I felt like my senior year, I should major in sociology. And I had no clue what sociology was, but my senior year of high school, I said, that's what my major is going to be. And I went down that path, realized I wanted to go to the business angle because that's where I could tell there was more money and more freedom available. And so I said, well, I should be a business consultant. I want to be like the Bobs from Office Space, if you've watched that movie, right? And so I was on that path, but I figured I kind of listened to my own dad's advice. He'd always say, get real world experience. Don't just get book smarts, but get the real life smarts too. And I thought, I'm going to take a sabbatical from college and I'm going to go find some business to start, because I don't want to be the guy that comes out with an MBA telling people how to run their businesses, but I'm just this, stupid, ignorant kid that's just trying to tell people what to do when I have no real authority in that sense. And so I basically took a sabbatical from college. I was looking around, didn't know what to do. And then finally one of my friends said, yeah, I just got interviewed and I'm interning with this financial firm. It's really cool. And I thought, I was kind of like, like Adam Sandler in The Wedding Singer. He's like, I like money. I like to get more of it. I have a jar on my refrigerator. That's where you come in, right? Yeah. That's kind of what I was like. I was like, okay, I took some banking and accounting classes and whatnot, but I'm like, I think I would like to try this out. And so I decided to interview. I didn't know that they would hire anybody off the street as long as you could pass a test with 70% and not be, haven't robbed a bank. And so I got hired, 100% commission only when I started. And I really started to buy into the whole, not just the methodology, right? The whole aspect of investing and everything else. It wasn't just about that, but even just about the fact that, that really I love being my own boss. I love being an entrepreneur. And so I ended up dropping out of college, never went back. I actually avoided, I was like one paper away from getting my degree. And so I basically dropped out and kept doing that path. And for 4 years, I was a financial advisor, even became a stock coach. I was even training people how to trade stocks and options on the side. In fact, my broker dealer required me to drop my Series 6 and 63 in 2005 because they said, hey, you can't do this and that at the same time. I said, well, I'm not giving stock recommendations. They're like, it's too close. You either pick this or that. I said, well, I'm picking the stock coaching. So, because I could already tell I could make way more money in the stock market doing that than I would doing mutual funds. So I said, screw that. So I just kept my insurance licenses and that was it. Well, just later that same year, my dad reaches out. He says, well, Chris, when are you going to advise me? And I was shocked because this is the guy that changed my diapers for one. And then two, he was like the penny pinching saver, right? The guy, he would say frugal. We all said cheap, like the cheapest guy you've ever met, very Depression era mentality. He was the kind of guy that Dave Ramsey would look up to, right? Like Dave Ramsey's like, I need to use his stuff to teach to my people. That's what Dave Ramsey would do, right? And so my dad was that guy. And so I sat down with my dad. It was over Thanksgiving. And I'm looking at all his finances. And I said, Dad, you've done a great job. Look, you're debt-free, 100%. You've even paid off your house. You did that like 18 years. Look, you've been stuffing money in your 401k, getting the match like every good boy and good girl should. You're doing everything right. I said, Dad, but here's the deal. You're 61 years old. If you want to retire today, based on where you're at right now, you better hope you die in about 5 or 6 years because that's when you're going to run out of money. He said, well, that's not the answer I wanted. I'm tired of this job. The stress is literally killing me. I've had heart attacks and strokes. I want out. What do? I said, I don't know. Work longer, save more. That's pretty much your option. And I was really bothered by that because I mean, this is the guy that I thought I could be able to help. And here it is. The guy did everything right and it just wasn't enough. Even worse, I was on the same path as him because I was drinking the Kool-Aid. I thought if I just kept scrimping and saving like he did, turn off the AC in the summertime, turn off the heat in the winter so I can save some, a couple bucks to throw in my mutual funds, maybe I'll be able to retire in my 40s or 50s. And I'm starting to see that it's not true. And that next month, I'm talking with a friend who I trained to be a financial advisor, but then he left to go do real estate investing. And he's telling me, he's like, Chris, well, how many of your clients are financially free where they don't worry about money each day? I said, well, they all worry about running out of money too soon or outliving their money. So none. Great job, Chris. Way to help no one. How about this? How many of you guys as financial advisors are financially free, not off the commissions you're earning, but actually doing these same investments you've been recommending? And as I was really thinking about it, and again, this is the end of 2005, and I'm realizing, I'm like, wait, there's guys who've been working in my office since the 1970s, and they look like they're not slowing down anytime soon. They look like they're still broke. So I said, maybe none. There's your problem. And so I was like, well, give me a recommendation. Like, tell me, what should I do? He's like, no, you just got done telling me that stocks are better than real estate. So I'm not going to tell you. I'm like, okay, you've got me open. Give me something. He's like, all right, if you're serious, and I don't think you are. By the way, this guy wasn't selling anything. He was just doing a great takeaway sale on me. But he's like, if you're really serious, go get this book by Robert Kiyosaki called Who Took My Money, which is a lesser known Rich Dad book, but it pretty much just tells you that mutual funds suck. There, I just saved you 3 hours on audiobook. And then of course he's like, and go listen to this radio show, this AM talk radio show that these real estate investors do here in the state of Utah. And so I did. And after a couple months, I got to this choice. I said, either I stay in the business, I put blinders on and ignore all the truth that I've learned, that even though it doesn't work, I just keep my practice going because that's how I make money. Or two, I quit and keep my integrity intact. And so I chose the latter. And I vowed never to teach about money again. I just said, you know what? I'll keep stock coaching and I'll be a mortgage broker. So because 2006, anybody could be a mortgage broker. It's like 2021, right? So that's what I was doing. But I wanted to know what these guys did. Like, I want to know how these real estate guys were becoming multimillionaires in their 20s and 30s. And so I started to do follow that same path. Later that year in 2006, when I was 28, almost 29 years old, I got to the point where I had enough passive income that I realized I was work optional. I could quit all my work that I was doing and just do that. And that was a shocker. The fact that I was working a few hours a week and I could be, completely retired, right? And now I wasn't expecting that. and it happened way faster than I expected. And of course, any 28-year-old that all of a sudden now doesn't need to have to work anymore, family and friends were like, wait, what's this guy doing? And I didn't know what to tell them. I was like, I sell drugs. Like, that's the only thing I do to buy some time to try to figure out how do I explain what I'm doing right now? Because I started focusing on cash flow and passive income versus accumulating my wealth, right? And so I eventually, end of 2006, I got connected with some partners. One of them you might know of, Garrett Gunderson.
Yep.
We actually partnered up to create a company that was his predecessor to Wealth Factory, and we were going to save the world. We're going to help people get out of the rat race. Only in 2007 to then get in the rat race again, because one, he wanted me to cut off income streams I had outside of the business and just go all in on the business. So we're putting all our money into that. Two, our market were all real estate investors, primarily real estate flippers, who in 2007 got hit the first and the hardest. And so all of a sudden that's drying up. We're not getting paid in our business. That's in the hole. Personally, I end up going in the hole too, because now my real estate's starting to tank and everything else. I can't get equity out because the banks say, hey, we don't give cash out refinances anymore as of the summer of 2007. And the next thing I know, I went from millionaire to upside down millionaire, being over $1 million in debt. And I stopped teaching people how to get out of the rat race because I can't teach something I don't do myself. I'm a horrible poker player. You'll win every time because you'll know if I'm bluffing. And so I was like, okay, I can't teach this stuff anymore, but I can teach them what I am doing, which was how to find money, because that's what I was getting desperate, right? I was trying to figure out, how do I find money? How do I do this stuff? And so eventually people would come to me and they say, hey, I would love to learn the things that you know, but honestly, I just can't afford it. I just don't have the cash. Now, in the back of my head, I would say to myself, they're way better off financially than I am right now. I wouldn't say that verbally because that's business suicide, right? So what I would say verbally is, well, if I can help you find the money, will you pay me? They said, of course. And so that's what I started doing. I started helping them find creative ways to find and free up cash, creative ways to pay off debt. The whole cash flow index is something I created in 2008 when I was going broke. I was actually playing Cash Flow 202 when I created that formula, for paying off debt. And, I started doing all this stuff and showing them ways to save on taxes and, tracking money and things like that. And the next thing you know, next year, 2009, we start pulling ourselves out of that hole. Like when we're nearly bankrupt as a company, you start pulling ourselves out, especially in the chiropractic and dental spaces. And then that started to help me personally too, because then I started making more money to help dig out of my debt hole because I didn't file for bankruptcy. Some of those days I wish I did. It would have been easier to hit the reset button versus trying to pay it all back. But I'm just too dang stubborn, So I did it eventually. And then by the end of, fast forward, eventually I created my own company, Money Ripples, in 2012. And then 2015 went through a divorce. But at the end of 2016, finally got to the point where I had cash coming in, paying off debt, to where I had enough passive income to retire again the second time. So where I became work optional again. And that's what I teach people to do now, right? Is really how do you become work optional where, because most people don't necessarily want to retire. I know I can't. Like I just get bored and I get depressed if I try to quit everything. But I do like to get to the point where I have enough passive income where I know I don't have to work anymore. And that's really what I teach other people to do too.
Wow, quite a journey you've spent there. Yeah, we've had Garrett on the show, and he's definitely been leading the charge, right, since Kiyosaki, with some other big thought leaders out there in terms of certain strategies around this, around thinking about your wealth differently. And yeah, I like what you said, right? I think that's what it's all about, right? Financial freedom. And we talk about that a lot on this show, right? Is right. Yeah. What does wealth actually really mean? What does financial freedom actually mean? But just having enough of that, whatever you want to call it, right? Passive income, mailbox money, it's creating freedom in your life, right? To be able to spend time the way you want to spend time, freedom of relationships, who you want to actually work with and spend your time, and then having that purpose, and even if you are still working, right, but just increasing the purpose of your life, right, is exponential. Right. To be able to, maybe you're trying to create impact or do other those things, but you just have a lot more choices, right? Being able to get there. And of course, you might this has been my journey is, I'll hit financial freedom number, but then I don't want to stop working either. I like what I'm doing. And then I'll actually put pressure on myself to increase fixed costs because I want to live a bigger life. Right.
Yeah.
And I want to do more things. So then you go up and then you try to now drive, more ways to actually increase, income there. So let's go back to your, the beginning, right? And I think this is helpful for listeners to really understand, what are some of the myths out there from Wall Street and maybe traditional planning that just really don't make sense, right? What are some of those myths that are out there? One of them we talked about with the 401k match. Maybe that's a good one, but any other top ones that are, that come to mind for you?
It's interesting because on my Money Ripples podcast right now, I'm going through all the different myths and things you have to overcome to then kind of bridge and become financially, like you're saying, financially free. And I see financial freedom, financial independence differently. Financial independence is you have enough passive income to replace your income or pay for your expenses. Financial freedom is where money is no longer the reason or excuse that you do or do not do anything, right? It's almost a state of being or mind that goes along with the freedom, and it's so interesting is that I thought I might come up with 5 or 10 myths. I'm well over 20 and I keep adding to the list every time. I'll like be in the middle of talking about a certain subject and I'll say something. I'm like, ooh, that's another myth I'm going to have to address later, right? There's a ton, but really it comes down to this overall theme. It's always deferral, right? Set it and forget it, spend nothing, save everything, save it forever, save in these mutual funds, and hopefully someday you'll have something. Right? That's really what it comes down to. And it's always about locking your money in prison. If you think about financial advice, everything that's been taught is about locking your money away in those retirement accounts, like your 401ks and your IRAs. You can't touch it. If you try to touch your own money, you get slapped with penalties and then taxed on it, right? Assuming it's a 401k or IRA, not the Roth. But even then, you can still get penalized in a Roth. So you got all these like stupid things that go with that. And then the other advice is pay off all your debt. Right? Just like my dad did. He was told to do it. He did all the stuff that he was recommended to do by all the financial gurus at the time. And even today, people are still saying the same crap. Lock your money in equity in that house. I learned firsthand, locking money in equity in house is a bad thing. Because what happened in the last recession? I was actually doing the Dave Ramsey method, with my house. I had bought a new house in 2006, but I was paying equity down. Why? Because I was a mortgage broker. I figured worst case scenario, I can always just do a cash out refinance to get the money out. But after 2007, I had all this equity in that house. I couldn't get to it. The banks wouldn't let me, which said, well, do I want to really sell my house? And it was my dream home. I didn't want to have to sell it until I got desperate. But by the time I got desperate, guess what happened to real estate values? They tanked, right? And pretty soon, all that equity was gone. And now we're talking about short selling the house. And then the bank wouldn't let me short sell the house where they'd sell it for less than what you owe on the mortgage. They said, nope, we refuse those offers. That just give you a context that the house that I had actually appreciated up to $740,000, which back then was a lot. And then it depreciated down to about 500,000, right? Give or take. And so I was trying to sell it because I owed about, 500 some odd thousand. We actually had an offer to sell it for 515,000. The bank refused it because the bank was owned by Lehman Brothers. Wow. So they were doing all their mortgage fraud practices at the time. So eventually I had to foreclose in 2009 on that house and it sold for $342,000. I mean, I wish I was the guy that bought that house, right? And so I learned firsthand, keeping equity in a house is a bad idea. I'm not saying have a paid off house is not a good thing. I think you can definitely pay paid off homes and stuff, but I learned locking your money away, where if I would have had that equity in my hands during that period of time, I could have weathered that storm. And I had my 6+ months reserve too. So it wasn't like I didn't have savings. It wasn't like I was deeply in debt. The deeply in debt happened after I was negative cash flow for so long, because I was in the hole like 16,000 a month, that it was horrible. So when people say, oh, you got to pay off your home, lock it away in 401ks and IRAs, the only person that benefits, the only group of people that benefits are the financial advisors who get paid whether you make money or not. And then secondly, the companies that they work for. And when you realize that all the information you've been taught has come from those financial companies, taught through financial advisors and even the financial experts, and even the financial channels who are paid, the sponsorships are all paid by these big companies who literally put billions of dollars of marketing into it. We get taught all this stuff. I remember learning high risk creates high returns. But then, we we have to renew our licenses every couple of years, right? With our continuing education, it always comes back to that same old question. What's the definition of risk? Chance of loss. When does a higher chance of losing equal a higher chance of winning? If a 90% chance of losing does not mean you have a 90% chance of winning. It's a 10% chance of winning, right? But they've led us to believe that we take all the risk while they take none of it. So things like that. Even we mentioned the 401k, right? I mean, some people will say like, oh, well, the reason I do the 401k, even though they're like, yeah, maybe it's not the best, but I get a match, right? Okay, cool. You get 100% match. Well, that 100% match, is it truly 100% compounded return? And the answer is no. If you ever put into a calculator, someone saving $10,000 a year in their 401k, getting a 108% return, like in the stock market, you'll find out that you'll be richer than Bezos in just a few decades. And never have I ever seen anybody on the media saying, hey, I got wealthy and famous because I saved $10,000 a year in my 401k and got my company matched too. Like, it never happens, right? Long term, what's interesting is that match might add about a 3% compounded return at the end, right? Because all it does is just double your money in the end. And in the beginning, it's awesome. It is 100% return at the beginning, but the longer you have it, because of how compounding interest works, that rate of return declines over time because it's only on the new money. And so it ends up being about a 3% difference, long term. What's crazy is I decided, and this is the thing, like I got blasted on my YouTube channel because people are like, who is this idiot? This got to be the worst financial expert I've ever heard of. Like, come on, like it's 100% return. Like, he's stupid. He's using girl math, right? I was like, no, I'm literally using a compounding interest calculator to figure this out. But then here's the thing is like, I actually went and researched Fidelity. I went to their target date funds because right now about 86% of people use target date funds. And I want to know what's the performance compared to the actual S&P 500. Because everybody tells you, oh, it's just like the S&P. Well, guess what? The 10-year performance on those target date funds, if you go out beyond, to the longer term ones like 2035 and beyond, they're pretty much all the same return. They're almost all the same investments. And the return was 2.1% less than the S&P.
Hey, it's Dave Wolcott here. Let me ask you something. Are you tired of the same old financial advice that leaves you spinning your wheels? If you're ready to discover the real secrets the ultra wealthy use to build unstoppable wealth, then I've got something just for you. My new book, The Holistic Wealth Strategy, is your ticket to learning the proven strategies that the top 1% don't want you to know. This book isn't just about money. It's about building a life of purpose, freedom, and lasting impact. And I want to give you a free copy. Visit holisticwealthstrategy.com and get yours today. It's time to level up your financial game and create the future you deserve.
Now, the S&P over the last 30 years, if you look at the actual return of the S&P, has been about 8.4% since 1995. That's the average actual compounded return using the S&P price, right? Well, that's 8.4%. Well, think about this. You take away over 2%, now you're getting down to around 6%. But that does not include the fees, because also in those target date funds with Fidelity, it's a minimum fee of 0.75%. I was shocked when people were like, no, you pick the ones that you pick these indexes and these target date funds, they don't have all those fees. I'm like, they have those fees. Fidelity literally put it right there saying the minimum fee for them, not including the administrative fees that you have from the plan through your company, those fees are 0.75%. So you put it together, that's about 3%. So guess what? You got that 3% extra compounded return with the 100% match, but you're doing 3% worse than if you just got an S&P 500 index on your own. So you literally just washed it out. Like you would literally make the same amount of money, saving your money outside of the 401k, not getting your company match, putting in the S&P 500 index, which is not my favorite, but it's an option. You could do that and make just as much money as you would get in the 401k with a 100% match. And most people don't even get the 100% match anymore. It might be a 50% match, or they try to max fund it and they only get up to a certain percentage. So that return actually becomes less. I've seen some examples where people max fund their 401ks and only adds an extra 1.5% on the performance. Well, if it's 3% worse, you're not even making up for the bad performance. You're just worse off. That's one of those sacred cows. People are like, no, the 401k is awesome. It's brainless. Nobody should question that. Why not? Question it. Look up the actual evidence. That's the thing. I know I'm kind of ranting.
Yeah, no, Chris, you are spot on with that, and I'm glad you brought some highlights to that. Right, people should really look at the numbers and do the diligence on that, and that's really just the tip of the iceberg, right? Because I got actually so frustrated, and frankly, I was doing so much better in alternatives and real estate that 15 years ago, I went through the math and said, hey, what if I even take this sacred cow and actually exit my 401k? I'll pay the 10% penalty. And, we created this calculator for it, which, by the way, if any of the listeners want it, we've got a calculator we can share with you on that, which is, hey, I would break even, say, in about 5 years, if my assumptions were right. But then when I started to look at the compounding, right, because I could get tax-free compounding on real estate or some other assets, right? If I use an IBC policy, I can even get additional leverage on it from there, right?
Yeah.
And then over 10, 20, 30 years, it was amazing. In fact, the numbers are, if you take 100K, okay, and you paid 35% taxes, 10K, 10% of the penalty on that, you have a net investable 55K. And if you can compound that at 20% over 20 years, it's actually over 2 million. And if you left the 100K in the 401k, it comes out to about 385K. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's before taxes, fees, and inflation, which we didn't talk about inflation either.
Yeah.
Right. So
I was going
it's
there
quite
next.
interesting. Yeah, it's quite interesting. And I like your background, right? You're really analytical and you're looking at this much like I did too, right? I started to run my own math and say, okay, what makes sense? And they hide, right? They hide the fees. They're also not talking about inflation, which, we've seen can have a massive impact, right, on the devaluation of the dollar, right? And so that's kind of evolved our thesis into thinking that, hey, we need to be buying real assets, right, like real estate, where you can get tax efficiency, you can drive forced appreciation, and you have passive income today. Because like, Garrett so wonderfully put in his book, right, all about accumulation theory. Does it really make sense to save up for this, this big, golden nest egg at some point in the future? And then, like you say, hope you don't outlive your money. Why not creating that financial independence today when you're 35 or 45 or 55 and just take back control of your life?
That's exactly it. No, that's the problem, that there's all these assumptions that we've been told, right? I mean, we're told the stock market returns 12%. I used to pull out the Ibison charts as a financial advisor saying, hey, look, you put $1 in 1928 and now you'll have $5 billion. No, not really that much, but way higher than I'd show real estate as way down, just barely above inflation, because it would be home prices. I'd show them things like inflation. And in
so
fact,
tell me, wait,
numbers,
okay, let's unpack that a second.
Yeah.
So why is that 12%? Because it's amazing. I see all kinds of, whether it's on social media, on Bloomberg or whatever, are they selecting the data set to be able to get to a 12% number, or where are they coming up with that?
Well, it's that average versus actual return, right?
Yeah.
And I'm sure you've probably taught on the show where if you lose 50% one year, you have to make 100% the next year. Funny enough, I actually learned that while I was a financial advisor after 3 years in. It was actually a product guy that came in, and we all got the answer wrong. He's like, if you have 100,000 in annuity, you lose 50%. How much you have? 50,000. We're thinking we're all smart because we can do math. And then, and he's like, well, what rate of return do you need to get back to breaking even? And we all said 50%, right? It's like, if we lost 50%, we need 50% break even. He's like, no. Because if you went down to $50,000, 50% only makes you $25,000. You only go up to 75. He's like, you need 100% return. He's like, so what's the average? And we were doing the math, 100 minus 50 is 50, divided by 2 years, 25% return, but your actual was 0, right? And that's the thing, is both are true numbers. But if you're a financial company, which one would you rather show? The one that shows 25%, the one that shows 0%? And then you don't factor in fees, which means you made less than 0. Right?
Yeah,
which one
exactly.
You show 25.
Yeah, and the other really important note here for listeners, right, is to know that is on your compounded returns, right? So 2008, 2022, right? If you've been accumulating and let's say you're 63 and you have that big 50% loss or 20% loss, I mean, that is a massive chunk, right? You don't have the time to be able to make up for that as much.
And I witnessed that firsthand. I mean, 2000, I became a financial advisor just after 2001, right? Right after 9/11. And, I saw what happened with Y2K. I was right in the middle of it. I was birthed in that crisis of Y2K. 2002 was the worst year. Funny enough, 9/11, the market was coming back up after 9/11, but it was 2002 when there's all the corporate fraud, like the Arthur Anderson and, all that stuff, Enron, that was going on. That was fun because I actually had people that were employed by Enron in Utah. So talking to those people were pretty pissed off. So anyways, like all that was going on. And I saw it firsthand. I mean, people that literally I'd work with over the years, like they'd say it wasn't until 2015 that people said, I put my money in 2000 when I was at the market high. It took me till 2015 to get my money back. Even though 2013 is when it got back up to on the stock market, but because of those fees, it took another 2 years for those people to get breaking even. That's part of what happened to my dad, right? Like he was thinking, hey, if I just keep going, especially with Y2K leading up to 2000, he's like, this keeps up, maybe I could retire in my 60s if it kept up, but it was already way overvalued, much like it is today in 2025. It was way overvalued. Things are out of whack. Tech stocks were overvalued beyond what they should be, much like today with our Mag 7 and everything else. And so that's the thing that people don't realize. Most people that are under the age of 40 have never seen a market loss. 2022 was a blip for them. But in 16 years, you have one down year. That's not the Wall Street waltz that we've seen historically, where it's usually 2 years down, 5 years up, right? Give or take. That's not happened. We're way overdue for correction. So throw that in there with everything else, inflation being underestimated because they've altered the numbers. Go to shadowstats.com to learn about that, and realize inflation is higher than it actually it's reported to be, and returns are lower than you realize they were. No wonder guys like my dad and so many other Americans can't really retire comfortably.
Yeah. And what a terrible spot to be in. I mean, if you've worked all of your life, right, and you're at that point in your life, and also medical expenses are at the highest point of ever, and right, we keep seeing those increase. We've seen crazy things with the housing market, these days. So you really, I mean, you don't want to be in a state of fear, right, at that point, right? You want to have full protection for you. Any other key myths you want to share, last myths in terms of things that people should really be, double checking on to see if it makes sense for them?
Yeah, let's talk about the 4% rule. That's another little sacred cow, especially if you're part of the FIRE movement, the financially independent retire early. I actually joined that Facebook group because literally I did it twice by the time I was 39. You'd think they would welcome me with open arms. Funny enough, I did not realize that the way that they defined FIRE was not how I got FIRE in reality. It's very much based on put your money in S&P 500 index funds, right? And save as much as you can, minimalize your lifestyle so then you can live as cheap as you can, which is not necessarily always bad, but it's not always good either. Minimize your lifestyle so that you have so little and you just put all your money into the S&P 500, and eventually they'll say you can live on 4% a year. So as an example, if you have $1 million, 4% a year is $40,000 a year you can live on. So if they're cheap enough, they can make it work. Well, it's interesting because I mentioned to them, I said, hey, that 4% rule was debunked a long time ago. And they kicked me out of the group for saying that, which is interesting because there's actually legitimately big institutions that redo that number every year. And it's right around 3% right now if you're going to retire in your 60s. Now, if you're going to retire in your 70s, 4% does work, right? But the 3% doesn't. Interesting that the guy that created the 4% rule, which he never intended to be a rule anyways, he was only looking at the market from 1926 to 1976. He took that 50-year period and said, based on all the ups and the downs, how much could you pull out per year and not run out of money? And given in about a 20, 25-year span. Well, he came up with that 4% rule. What's interesting, he has a new book coming out now saying, oh, you don't need 4%, it's 5% now. So he's now even like doubling down, digging in his heels, saying it's actually higher if you have properly managed diversified funds in like international stocks and here and here and here. I'm like, this guy is just basing this all on the fact the market keeps going up, which it doesn't always, but most companies will say it's 3%. If you're trying to retire early, and this is what I told one of my friends, because he's like, yeah, I'm 30 years old. I go over $1 million. I'm financially independent now. I said, well, for you, it's a 2% rule because you're so young and you have so many years to go. And with inflation being higher than they report, returns being lower than you think they are, it actually needs to be 2% for you. He's like, you saying I have to save up double the money now? I said, yeah, if you want to be financially independent. He's like, no, I don't want to believe it. No. Because he had worked so hard. I was like, dude, it's not that you did anything wrong. Like having over $1 million as a 30-year-old is impressive, right? By the way, this guy actually works with a lot of real estate investors, but he keeps going to the stock market, So anyways, long story short, like I just tell people like, listen, like you can do that. And that's the accumulation theory you're talking about, right? Is that we think we got to save and just hoard up squirrel up for this winter of retirement. And hopefully the winter won't last too long, right? And that's the problem with the 4% rule, is that people are living longer, much longer than they were in 1976. Also, inflation is bigger because in 1974, we got to take off the gold standard. Inflation was not the same as it is today. It's much, much higher today. You got to pull out less for that money to last if you're going to do that kind of method, right? But there is a better option. And that's what got me so excited by the time that I quit being a financial advisor, was when I started to see the light that it wasn't about accumulation. It was about acceleration and passive income, right? What's the actual income? That's what we all want, is income at the end of the day. And so for me, and I'll give you a real life example this time, what opened my eyes was I said, wait a minute. So I don't even have to buy rentals, because I used to think you just buy a property in your backyard. And yeah, I had those too. But I said, wait, could I lend my money to real estate investors? They're like, yeah. And at the time they're paying more, but let's make it an easy number. They're like, yeah, well, you can get paid 1% a month, right? Which now you'll find deals like that today. Well, that means if I have that same $1 million, instead of living on $30,000 a year or less, if I'm younger, I can now live on $10,000 a month or $120,000 a year. That's a very different, same money, but different aspect, right? And that's kind of what happened with one of our clients. This guy, he actually heard me on another real estate podcast, and he started following ours and reached out. As we worked with him, he had $1 million he saved up in his retirement plan. By the way, this guy was like the 4th highest ranking general in the state of California. Had $1 million saved up in his retirement plan, 60 years old. And the financial advisor says, cool, you can live on 3%. So the financial advisor actually taught him well. He actually said, you can live on 3% at your age. That's $30,000 a year. And he said, I live in California. Homeless people live on $30,000 a year. I can't do that. And so that's when he found us, and we started looking at alternatives, right? And so we started diversifying things, like he got some duplexes that were, property managed for him. So more turnkey duplexes. He did some real estate syndications. He did some oil and gas syndication, things like that. And the next thing you know, his same $1 million, instead of making $30,000 a year, is making him over $130,000 a year, right? And that, I think, is the biggest thing, because some people might argue like, well, I can make just as good return to the market. And that might be true, but you can't live on the same kind of returns in the market. That's the difference. Because of the way that the market can go up or down, you have to be careful not to pull out too much. Where if I get like a contractual return on my money, not saying it's guaranteed, but I'll tell you, I'd much rather gamble, quote unquote, I'd rather bank on real assets paying me than arbitrary things like stocks. Even though I used to trade stocks and options, I learned pretty quickly, no one knows what's going to happen with those. But with real estate, man, I can make so much more money with more security, more collateral, and more certainty. I want predictable passive income. And I think that's the thing that everyone needs to understand.
Yeah, for sure. There's a great example I'd like to share with people to really simplify this, right? And just make it clear. So let's say you take the typical path on accumulation theory, right? And you use the 4% rule. And let's say someone worked hard for 40 years and saved up 4 million, right? And thinking, they did great. So at 4% of that, right? That's 160K. Mm-hmm. Now, if you take out taxes, fees, and inflation, might be more like 110K, right? That you're actually living on, might be the actual true number in terms of cash flow. And so you start to take out that, that capital goes down from your total nut every year. Now let's compare that to the passive income strategy that we're talking about. And let's say you had the 4 million in assets like real estate, private equity, different syndications, a portfolio of different syndications. And you have the same 4 million, and it would be very realistic to draw an 8% cash flow return on that. Yeah. Okay, so now you're at 8%, which would be 320,000 that you have in terms of income. And if it's likely in tax efficient real estate, oil and gas, right? Some other investments. So now you're at 320 net. And then the biggest difference also is that you're not killing your golden goose, because you're actually your whole asset value continues to rise every year. You're not killing it by 4%. So this is how you can actually create legacy wealth. So, it's like, which scenario would you rather be under?
Yeah, that's right. That old scenario is always about spending down your money and hopefully you don't run out of it before you die, right?
Yeah.
Where you're talking
Yeah,
about your golden goose just lays bigger, fatter, juicier golden eggs, right? And that's
exactly.
and that's
Exactly.
more nutritious for you. That's going to do better for you. It's true.
Yeah.
And
Chris, any top
that's the thing that blew my
strategies?
mind. Yeah, I love that example.
Yeah. Any top you talked about helping people find capital. And I think that's such an interesting topic, right? We just had a
Yeah.
guy on last week. We were talking about using credit cards, right, and getting up to 500,000, right, interest free, right, as an example. There's a lot of people kind of creating. I recommend that a lot of people start creating businesses, even if you don't have a business. You could create a side hustle because now you can start to impact your overall tax strategy. You can create additional income that you have to invest. But, typically, right, you need some capital sources to kind of get that going. So are there any top ones you can recommend?
I'm not huge on leveraging, debt and things like that. But I mean, I think the biggest thing, like I said, get money out of prison. And the biggest areas we tend to find money is it could be home equity. That's an area that could be taken advantage of, but again, it just depends because where interest rates are right now. Definitely, unproductive savings. I know you see it. I mean, we run into people all the time that have old life insurance policies that just, have never been utilized because they've been sold as an accumulation thing, not as something you can use now, right? So a lot of times people are like, oh, wait, I do have cash there. I didn't even think it was there because they just never think it's an asset. I've had a lot of times we look at things like, even IRAs and 401ks. Do we self-direct them or not? Like you mentioned, I had a guy that was 52 years old that we did the math together and it made sense to cash it out, take the 10% penalty and taxes, and then invest it, and he would make more money doing that than just leave it in the market, and so things like that. Another area I find that people often don't know is if they have other properties, like maybe they have investment properties already. Because I get people that say, well, I'm already doing real estate. In fact, my return on my investment's awesome. And they look at their original investment and what it's returning, and the cash flow could be amazing, which is great. The one thing I look at is what's called return on equity. What's the equity in that property and what's the net income that you're getting from it? I'll give you an example. I had one client out in San Diego. He had a property that he just loved. Him and his wife is like their first property. They were gonna and their whole method, again, because I have a lot of Asian clients, and Asians are like the best savers in the world, right? And he's like, here's my goal, Chris. In 6 years, I'm gonna be 100% debt free. I'm gonna take all the extra cash I have, pay off my house and this rental property. And I said, okay, well, let's take a look at this. And what would you free up? And after we take out the tax insurance, because that doesn't count, because that doesn't free up, when we look at just the principal and interest, it would free up about $4,200 a month. Specifically, he had an investment property that if he paid it off, it would make him $2,400 a month. Right now, it was only making him $200 a month of profit. Guess what? He had $700,000 of equity in that house. And it took me 2 years to convince him to finally sell that property because they were so emotionally attached to it.
Yeah.
And so finally he did sell it, got the 700,000 out, and then he went and bought 6 properties out in Louisiana. Not my first choice for a location, but he did. Bought those 6 properties, and then he just reinvested the cash flow from those. He emailed me just last year and he says, Chris, this would have been year 5, by the way. So he would have almost been at the point of paying off his mortgages at this point to where he would have made that $2,400 a month. He said, Chris, I've now reinvested the money we've made on these properties, and now we're making $8,000 a month, about $100,000 a year. So he went from maybe 30,000 a year, not even that much, to now over $100,000 a year just because he got that money out of that prison, right? So that's the big thing that we look at there. Even like trying to save money in taxes and money leaks and stuff. I had one client that before he even invested anything, we freed up about, actually it was about $100,000 a year, $4,000 a month just by refinancing their house and paying off some loans and stuff. By the way, they weren't broke. They had $5 million in stocks and Meta and Google stocks specifically, and they were making like $400,000 a year too, and business owners and everything. So got them to refinance and just consolidate some of their debt, freed up about $4,000 a month there, saved them $30,000 a year on taxes by giving them a better CPA. And then we also sold off one of their properties. That same thing had a couple $100,000 of equity, but it was making 0 net cash flow. We're like, get rid of that. That's making a horrible return on equity. Let's get that over, right? And as a result, we're like, hey, we didn't have to invest $1. We've already improved your cash flow by $100,000 a year. Now let's go and invest some of these stocks, and we'll get you financially independent within this year. So And we didn't have to sell off all their stocks to do it. That's the thing. It's like they still want to keep stocks. Great. I'm not a big fan of Wall Street necessarily. Like I now literally have nothing in Wall Street right now. I'm like Buffett. Buffett has 30% of his money in cash right now. I'm doing the same thing, except I'm like 100% out of the market because I just know that the values are just ridiculous and it's a gamble. It would just be ridiculously stupid to have any money in stocks right now.
Yeah. Yeah, such great use cases there, Chris. Appreciate you sharing those and all the wisdom you shared with us today. If you could give just one final piece of advice to the audience about how they could accelerate their wealth trajectory most, what would it be?
Follow those that have been there, done that, still doing it today. That's the thing, is like follow those people. Don't follow people that the people on social media that like they're 25 years old and they found one little thing that works. They bought that couple, Bitcoin or XRP or whatever it was, or they had that one trick pony that they did, but still the market hasn't necessarily come back into balance to show whether or not they're working, right? Like Warren Buffett says, it's when the tide rushes out that you find out who's swimming naked, right? And so find those people that have been there, they've done it, they're still doing it today. Those are the best people to listen to. Stop listening to the masses, because if it really worked for the masses, wouldn't the masses be financially free? Wouldn't we see more evidence of that? There shouldn't be Fidelity showing only 900,000 out of their 45 million clients have over $1 million in their stocks after literally decades of savings. Like you mentioned the $4 million example, there are so few people even have $4 million in savings because, again, it hasn't worked. So if it hasn't worked for so long, why would you think it's going to work today? And so just question everything you've been taught. Follow the real life examples of what's actually working. And there's tens of millions of us, just like Dave and myself, who have made it work.
Yeah. Love it. Thanks so much for coming in today, Chris, and sharing your wisdom with everyone. If people would like to reach out and learn more, what is the best place they can connect?
You just follow Money Ripples, right? Whether it's moneyripples.com, at Money Ripples on social media, or the Money Ripples podcast that you can find on any platform.
Awesome. Thanks again, Chris. Appreciate it.
Same here, Dave. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Wealth Strategy Secrets. If you'd like to get a free copy of the book, go to holisticwealthstrategy.com. That's holisticwealthstrategy.com. If you'd like to learn more about upcoming opportunities at Pantheon, please visit pantheoninvest.com. That's pantheoninvest.com.